Most philosophers build arguments. Lewis built a world. Not a metaphor and not a single world, but an entire ontology of worlds, plural. He believed in every one of them, the way you believe in the chair under you. That claim alone would make Lewis a curiosity. What makes him one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century is something different. He constructed a single interlocking system in which modal logic, causation, laws of nature, mental content, linguistic meaning, probability, value, and personal identity all reduce to one austere foundation. Remove one piece, and the load shifts across the whole structure. The foundation is what he called human supervenience. Everything that is true about the world, on this view, is fixed by the spatio-temporal arrangement of local intrinsic qualities. No hidden forces, no necessary connections lurking beneath the surface. Just the mosaic and everything else earned from it through philosophical analysis. That project is now over 50 years old. Parts of it are in better shape than when Lewis left them. Parts of it have been genuinely damaged by objections he never answered, and parts of it have mutated into positions Lewis himself might not have endorsed, as defenders adapt the framework to survive pressure from physics, from semantics, from the philosophy of science. What follows traces the architecture from its foundations upward. We begin with the mosaic itself, then build the modal framework that supports it, then the accounts of laws, causation, chance, and counterfactuals that make the system do its work. At every stage, the question is the same. Can this piece of the structure bear the weight Lewis placed on it? Part 1. The Humean Mosaic. Start with a question that sounds almost too simple to take seriously. What does it take to give a complete description of reality? Not a useful description or an interesting one, a complete one, leaving nothing out. One answer, the common sense answer, is that you would need to describe objects, their properties, the laws governing them, the causal relations between them, the chances of various outcomes, and perhaps the mental states of conscious beings. Each of these looks like its own independent category of fact. The law of gravitation seems to be something over and above the particular objects that obey it. The causal connection between a match strike and a flame seems to be something more than just the spatial arrangement of molecules. That answer is reasonable, and Lewis thinks it is wrong. Here is the problem he saw with it. Every time you add a new fundamental category, laws as primitive, causation as primitive, chance as primitive, you face the same difficulty. You have to explain how creatures made of ordinary matter come to know about these extra features of reality. If the law of gravitation is something over and above the pattern of gravitational behavior, what connects our evidence, which consists entirely of observed patterns, to the law itself? The epistemology becomes mysterious in proportion to the richness of the ontology. Lewis wanted an ontology where nothing is hidden from the pattern. His formulation, all there is to the world, is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. Factor this into two claims. First, all truths about a world supervene on the distribution of perfectly natural properties and relations in that world. Second, the perfectly natural properties and relations at this world are intrinsic properties of point-sized objects, plus spatio-temporal relations. That second thesis is doing quiet but critical work. It is saying that the fundamental relations are spatio-temporal, period. No irreducible causal relations, no irreducible nomic necessitation, no irreducible chance distributions. All of those must earn their keep by supervening on the arrangement of local qualities across space-time. A working physicist reading output from a particle detector sees this structure in action without naming it. She records field values at space-time points, checks them against predicted distributions, and never writes down a separate entry for the law that governs the field. The law is something she reads off the pattern, not something she measures independently. Lewis is claiming that the physicist's methodology reflects the actual structure of reality, not merely the limits of her instruments. Now, the first thesis, that truth supervenes on being, Lewis held to be necessary and a priori. He took it as a constraint on metaphysics itself. There cannot be two worlds that agree on which natural properties are instantiated everywhere, and yet differ in what is true. The second thesis, about which natural properties there are, he treated as contingent. It could turn out that our world has non-spatio-temporal fundamental relations. And Lewis knew that modern physics suggests exactly that. This is where the honest trouble begins. Quantum entanglement, as Tim Maudlin has argued forcefully, appears to involve irreducible relations between distant particles that are not spatio-temporal. Two electrons in a singlet state have correlated spin measurements, and Bell's theorem shows that no assignment of local properties to each electron individually can reproduce the correlations. The relation between them is non-local in a way that resists reduction to properties of space-time points. Lewis was entirely aware of this. He said his aim was to defend the tenability of Humean supervenience, not its truth. That qualification is revealing. It suggests the project is not primarily a bet on physics, but a methodological commitment. Show how much of philosophy can be done with a sparse ontology, and let the pressure points identify where sparseness genuinely fails. Recent work has sharpened this defensive posture. Yag and Lowe have argued that the philosophical value of Humean supervenience is largely independent of whether it correctly describes fundamental physical structure. Even if the quantum level requires non-Humean relations, higher-level reality, the level at which we talk about tables, brains and economies, may still be aptly modelled as a Humean mosaic. If so, the reductive program for laws, causation and chance retains its force in the domains where we actually apply those concepts. But this retreat raises a question Lewis never fully answered. If Humean supervenience holds only at higher levels, what grounds the difference between a genuine higher-level pattern and an artifact of our descriptive convenience? Lewis's own answer to that question depends on perfectly natural properties, which we take up later. For now, the critical point is this: the mosaic is not just a foundation. It is a bet that the world is, in principle, exhausted by local qualities and their arrangement, with everything else a consequence of that arrangement. And the first thing that needs to be a consequence, the one Lewis needed most urgently, is possibility itself. If there are no primitive modal facts, if the mosaic is all there is, then what makes it true that things could have been otherwise? That question forces us directly into modal realism. Part 2. Modal Realism. Begin with the puzzle Lewis was actually trying to solve, because it is not the one people usually ascribe to him. The standard story says Lewis believed in possible worlds because he had a taste for extravagant ontology. The actual story is that he needed to reduce modality, and every alternative reduction failed. The problem is this. Modal talk pervades philosophy and everyday reasoning. You say the bridge could have held more weight. The prosecutor says the defendant could have acted otherwise. The physicist says certain initial conditions were possible, but did not obtain. In each case, the claim has truth conditions, and those truth conditions involve ways things could have been. The standard philosophical move is to invoke possible worlds as an analytical tool, but deny that they are real. Call this ersatzism. Possible worlds are abstract representations, linguistic descriptions, or sets of propositions, not concrete realities. This sounds sober and responsible. Lewis argued it is neither. His argument against every form of ersatzism follows a common structure. Take a candidate for an ersatz world, say a maximally consistent set of sentences in some language. Now ask, what makes it true that this set of sentences could describe a reality? If you say it is consistent, you have used a modal notion, consistency, to ground possibility. You have not reduced modality, you have presupposed it. If instead you say the set of sentences is maximal in some non-modal sense, you face the problem that no language we possess can describe every possible configuration of properties in sufficient detail. Alien natural properties, properties not instantiated at our world, but instantiated at others, cannot be named or described from within our language. That last point about alien properties is where the argument cuts deepest. A linguistic ersatzist says a possible world is a kind of long sentence. But our language only has predicates for properties we have encountered or can construct from ones we have encountered. There is no reason to think that every metaphysically possible property falls into this category. So linguistic ersatzism cannot represent every possible world, and the space of possibilities is artificially truncated by the expressive limits of our actual language. Lewis's alternative. Possible worlds are concrete, spatio-temporally closed totalities, as real and as physical as the actual world. They are not made of propositions or language. They are made of objects bearing properties and standing in relations, exactly like our world. The word actual is an indexical, like here and now. We call our world actual because we are in it, not because it has a special ontological status. The formal structure is constrained by a recombination principle. Any arrangement of natural properties and relations that is internally consistent corresponds to a possible world. This principle generates the space of possibilities from the Mosaic itself. Possibility is not a primitive notion floating free of the physical. It is the range of coherent rearrangements of the kind of stuff that already exists. Now, the cost of this view is obvious, and was obvious to Lewis. He called the standard reaction to it the incredulous stare. You tell someone that there really exists a concrete world containing talking donkeys, and they simply look at you. Lewis treated this as a response, not an argument. The incredulous stare has no propositional content that can be evaluated. It registers surprise, but identifies no inconsistency, no false prediction, no theoretical deficiency. The serious objections are different. Kripke's concern, sharpened by others, is about what he called the problem of concern. Hubert Humphrey lost the 1968 presidential election. Lewis says it is possible that Humphrey won, and what makes that true is that a counterpart of Humphrey, a person very similar to him but distinct from him, wins in another concrete world. Kripke's objection: Humphrey could not care less about what happens to someone who is not him in some other universe. The whole point of saying Humphrey could have won is that he, the very individual, might have won. Counterpart theory on this view changes the subject from de re possibility to something else entirely. Lewis has a standard reply. It is a mistake to think that caring about one's counterpart requires identity with one's counterpart. We care about our future selves, who are not identical with our present selves, on a perdurantist view. The counterpart relation and the temporal continuation relation are analogous. Both are similarity relations that ground our legitimate concern without requiring strict identity. But there is a deeper challenge, one that has gained force through Alistair Wilson's work in the 2020s. Wilson has argued that Everettian quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, provides something close to genuine modal realism grounded in physics. On Wilson's view, the branching structure of the quantum state gives us concrete, causally isolated worlds, but they are generated by physical dynamics, not by recombination. This means the space of physically real worlds is constrained by the laws of quantum mechanics, not by free recombination of properties. This is a problem for Lewis, because his recombination principle generates vastly more worlds than quantum mechanics allows. Worlds with different fundamental constants, worlds with alien properties, worlds where quantum mechanics itself is false, all exist for Lewis. Wilson's quantum modal realism offers many of the same theoretical benefits: reduction of possibility to concrete existence, indexical actuality, but with a much more constrained ontology. If Wilson is right, Lewis's version of modal realism is like using a cannon where a rifle would do. The hardest objection of all, the one Lewis's defenders find most difficult to answer, comes from the philosophy of mathematics. Lewis defends modal realism partly by analogy with mathematical realism. We believe in numbers despite lacking causal contact with them, so we should be willing to believe in possible worlds on similar grounds. But this analogy cuts both ways. If knowledge of causally isolated entities is justified by their theoretical fruitfulness, then knowledge of possible worlds is only as secure as knowledge of mathematical objects. And mathematical knowledge faces its own deep epistemological puzzles that arguably become worse, not better, when extended to concrete, non-actual objects. Modal realism remains a live option in the literature, but it is an option almost no one accepts. Its primary function now is as a limiting case. It shows what a fully reductive account of modality would look like if you were willing to pay the ontological price. Most working metaphysicians help themselves to primitive modality in one form or another and build from there. Lewis saw this as a confession of defeat, an admission that modality cannot be earned from the Mosaic. Whether he was right about that depends on the details of counterpart theory, which is where the modal framework meets individual objects and their properties. Part 3. Counterpart theory. The standard framework for modal logic, Kripkean possible world semantics, treats identity across worlds as primitive. When you say Humphrey could have won, there is a world containing Humphrey, that very individual, and he wins in it. Worlds can share individuals, and what it is to be the same individual across worlds is taken as a basic fact. Lewis rejected this entirely, and not because of his modal realism. The rejection is driven by a problem about essences that arises before you ever take a stand on whether possible worlds are concrete. The problem is this. Suppose you allow that Humphrey exists in multiple worlds. In some worlds he is a politician. In some he is a plumber. In one, perhaps, he is never born at all, and his constituent matter forms part of a rock. If you say the very same individual exists across all these worlds, you need a principled answer to the question, which properties does Humphrey have essentially in every world where he exists, and which does he have merely accidentally? Without such an answer, the identity claim is empty, because there is no constraint on what counts as the same individual showing up elsewhere. The standard Kripkean response invokes rigid designation. Names like Humphrey pick out the same individual in every world, but this pushes the question back one step. What makes it the case that a particular individual in a distant possible world is the referent of Humphrey? If it is bare identity, a trans-world identity relation that holds primitively, then we have added yet another unanalyzable modal fact to our ontology. This is exactly the kind of primitive modality Lewis wanted to eliminate. Counterpart theory dissolves the problem by eliminating trans-world identity entirely. No individual exists in more than one world. When we say Humphrey could have won, what makes this true is that there exists in some other world an individual who is Humphrey's counterpart, someone who resembles Humphrey in contextually relevant respects, and that counterpart wins. The key move is that the counterpart relation is a similarity relation, not an identity relation, and similarity is context-dependent. When we ask whether Humphrey could have won the election, the relevant similarity might weight political career and personal history heavily. When we ask whether Humphrey could have been made of different matter, the relevant similarity might weight bodily continuity or origin. Different modal questions invoke different counterpart relations, and this is not a bug, but a feature. This context sensitivity gives Lewis something Kripkean semantics struggles with, an explanation of why essence ascriptions seem to shift depending on what we are asking about. Consider a wooden ship. When we ask whether this ship could have been made of aluminum, intuitions pull toward no, origin matters. When we ask whether this ship could have survived a plank-by-plank replacement, intuitions pull toward yes, continuity matters. On the Kripkean view, the ship has a fixed essence, and one set of intuitions must be wrong. On Lewis's view, different counterpart relations are appropriate for different questions, and both intuitions can be respected by recognizing which relation is operative in each context. Chris McDaniel has developed a serious alternative that accepts modal realism but rejects counterpart theory in favor of overlap. The same individual literally exists wholly present in multiple worlds. On this view, Modal claims are not about similar individuals, but about the very same individual having properties at different worlds. This avoids the Humphrey objection entirely, but reintroduces the essence problem that counterpart theory was designed to solve. If I am wholly present in two worlds with different properties, the question of which properties are mine, essentially, is back on the table with full force. Here is where the living tension in the current literature sits. Counterpart theory handles the flexibility of modal predication beautifully, but critics charge that its context sensitivity is too flexible. If the counterpart relation shifts with conversational context, then whether it is possible for Humphrey to win depends on pragmatic factors about which features of Humphrey are salient. This makes modal truth partly a matter of our interests, not of objective reality. Lewis's defenders argue that this is the right result, that our modal discourse was always interest-relative, and counterpart theory simply makes this explicit. His critics, following Kripke, insist that there are objective deromodal facts, that Humphrey could have won full stop, not relative to a similarity weighting. The resolution of this debate hangs on a question Lewis had independent resources to address: whether nature itself distinguishes some similarity relations as more objective than others. That question is the question of natural properties, and it is the hidden load-bearing pillar of the entire Lewisian system. Part 4. Natural Properties and the Joints of Nature. In 1983, Lewis published a paper that initially looked like a narrow contribution to the metaphysics of universals. It turned out to be the keystone of his entire philosophical system. The background problem is one that analytic philosophers had been living with for decades without resolving it. Properties, understood as sets of actual and possible individuals that share them, are wildly abundant. For any set of objects, however arbitrary, there is a property they all share, the property of being a member of that set. The set containing the Eiffel Tower, the number 7, and the leftmost electron in your body defines a property, one that all three members share. But this property is, in an obvious, if imprecise sense, gerrymandered. It does not carve nature at its joints. The trouble is that philosophy needs the distinction between natural and gerrymandered properties to do real work, and it needs it almost everywhere. Without it, the best system account of laws collapses, because any set of facts can be trivially systematized if you allow gerrymandered predicates. Without it, similarity is unconstrained, and counterpart theory loses its grip because anything resembles anything in some respect. Without it, the theory of mental content and linguistic meaning faces Kripke's rule-following problem head-on with no resources to respond. A teacher showing a child coloured blocks illustrates the problem concretely. The child sees a blue block, another blue block, a third blue block, and is asked to continue the pattern. She picks up a fourth blue block. But logically, the evidence is equally consistent with the child tracking the property blue and the property grew, where grew means blue if observed before some future time, and green otherwise. The evidence cannot distinguish between these hypotheses alone. Something must explain why blue is the projectable property, the one we learn and generalize from, and grew is not. Lewis's answer: blue is more natural than grew, and this naturalness is a feature of reality itself, not of our psychology. Lewis calls properties that carve at the joints perfectly natural properties. Mass, charge, spin, spatio-temporal distance. These are candidates for perfect naturalness, properties that form the fundamental alphabet from which all other truths can be composed. Less natural properties can be defined in terms of more natural ones, with naturalness decreasing as the definitions get longer and more complex. The question that immediately arises is what grounds naturalness itself. Lewis considered three options. First, naturalness could be analysed in terms of Armstrongian universals. A property is perfectly natural just in case there is a universal corresponding to it. Second, it could be analysed in terms of resemblance classes of tropes. Third, and this is the option Lewis increasingly favoured, it could be taken as primitive. Taking naturalness as primitive is a significant concession. Lewis's entire project is reductive, aimed at analysing philosophical concepts in non-modal, non-nomic terms. But if naturalness is primitive, then the foundation of the entire system contains an unanalysed notion that is neither spatio-temporal nor local. It is a fact about the world's structure that is not itself a fact about which qualities are instantiated where. Sider has pushed this line furthest in his 2011 book, generalizing Lewis's naturalness into a notion he calls structure, that applies not just to properties but to quantifiers, connectives, and other logical vocabulary. On Sider's view, the joints of nature go deeper than Lewis imagined, carving not just the space of properties but the space of possible descriptions. This is a radicalization of Lewis's insight, and it creates a tension. The more work naturalness does, the more it looks like exactly the kind of fundamental metaphysical posit that human supervenience was supposed to make unnecessary. The most serious contemporary challenge comes from Eden and Meacham, who have argued that Lewis's other accounts of laws, duplication, intrinsicality, causation and reference can be reformulated without any commitment to perfectly natural properties. Their strategy eliminates the naturalness constraint from the best system account and replaces it with pragmatic or epistemological criteria that do not require nature to have joints at all. If they are right, then the keystone Lewis spent decades defending is removable without the arch collapsing. But defenders of Lewis, including J. Robert G. Williams, have argued that the naturalness-free versions of these accounts lose explanatory power in precisely the places where Lewis's version succeeded. Without natural properties, the best system account cannot explain why our laws are objective rather than merely useful. Without natural properties, counterpart theory cannot explain why some modal claims seem more robust than others. The debate is live and unresolved, and it reveals how much of the Lewisian system rests on a single philosophical posit, whose credentials are themselves in question. The connection to the next topic is direct. Lewis's account of counterfactuals requires comparing possible worlds for overall similarity. Without natural properties, overall similarity is undefined, because everything resembles everything in infinitely many respects. The mechanics of how Lewis measures similarity between worlds is the engine that drives his accounts of counterfactuals, causation, and laws simultaneously. Part 5. Counterfactuals and Closeness. The standard approach to counterfactuals, before Lewis, treated them as a species of strict conditional. If A were the case, then B would be the case means that in all relevant possible worlds where A holds, B holds too. The problem with this approach is well known. How do you specify the set of relevant worlds? Too narrow, and you miss legitimate counterfactuals. Too broad, and everything follows from everything. Lewis replaced the strict conditional with a variably strict one. A counterfactual, if A were the case, B would be the case, is true just in case the closest possible worlds where A holds are also worlds where B holds. Closeness here means overall similarity to the actual world, weighted by specific criteria. There is no fixed set of relevant worlds. Instead, there is an ordering of worlds by similarity, and the truth of a counterfactual depends on what happens at the worlds nearest the top of that ordering. The machinery sounds elegant, but the philosophical weight falls entirely on the similarity metric. What makes one world closer to the actual world than another? Lewis proposed a system of priorities that he revised over the course of his career. The final version, from 1979, ranks factors roughly as follows. First priority: avoid big, widespread violations of the actual laws. Second priority: maximize the spatio-temporal region of perfect match with the actual world. Third priority: avoid small, localized violations of the actual laws. Fourth priority: secure approximate match of particular fact. The reason for this ordering is subtle and driven by a specific problem. Consider a deterministic world and the counterfactual. If Nixon had pressed the nuclear button, there would have been a nuclear war. In a deterministic world, the entire history of the world leads up to Nixon's not pressing the button. If the closest world where he presses it must obey the actual laws perfectly, then its entire history must be different from ours, because in a deterministic world, a different outcome requires different initial conditions. That makes the closest button-pressing world one with a completely alien past, which is absurd. Lewis's solution: allow a small, localized miracle, a tiny violation of the actual laws, just before the moment of the button press that diverges the histories. Before the miracle, the closest world matches ours perfectly. After it, the laws run forward normally, and nuclear war follows. The miracle is small and local, which is why it is preferred over the radical divergence of an entirely different initial condition. This is where a specific and famous objection from Kit Fine enters. Fine considered the counterfactual. If Nixon had pressed the button, then the laws governing nuclear reactions would still have held. On Lewis's account, the closest button-pressing world contains a small miracle, which means the laws are not perfectly preserved. Fine argued this was unacceptable because we evaluate counterfactuals against a background assumption that the laws hold. Lewis responded that the small miracle is in the service of maximizing match of particular fact, which is the thing we actually care about when reasoning counterfactually. The laws at the closest world are not the actual laws. They are laws that match actual laws, except for a small, precisely localized deviation. The deeper issue, one that Adam Elgar and Matthias Frisch have pressed, is that Lewis's similarity ordering builds in a temporal asymmetry that he never successfully grounded. The ordering says, match perfectly up to the moment of divergence, then let things evolve forward. But the fundamental laws of physics are time-symmetric. If you run the same similarity, ordering backward from some future event, you get different counterfactuals than if you run it forward from a past event. Lewis tried to explain this asymmetry by appealing to the de facto asymmetry of overdetermination in our world. Later states are overdetermined by earlier states, but not vice versa. But the source of that asymmetry is ultimately thermodynamic, resting on the low entropy initial condition of the universe. And that initial condition is itself contingent. So the temporal asymmetry of Lewis's counterfactuals depends on a contingent feature of the actual world that could fail at other possible worlds. This means Lewis's semantics gives different results for the same counterfactual sentence depending on features of the world that seem irrelevant to counterfactual reasoning. There is a practical dimension to this problem that reaches beyond philosophy seminars. Engineers evaluating structural failures use counterfactual reasoning constantly. If this bolt had been tightened, the bridge would not have collapsed. Lewis's semantics says this counterfactual is true because the closest bolt-tightened world matches our world perfectly except for a small divergence at the bolt, and in that world the bridge stands. But the engineer is not thinking about miracles or possible worlds. She is applying a background of presumed law-governed regularity. The extent to which Lewis's formal semantics captures or distorts what the engineer is actually doing remains an open question in the philosophy of counterfactuals. The machinery of closeness is not an end in itself. It exists to serve Lewis's analysis of causation, which is the topic that originally motivated his semantics for counterfactuals. And causation is where the machinery comes under the most intense pressure. Part 6. Causation. Lewis's original analysis of causation from 1973 is deceptively simple. Event C causes event E, just in case E counterfactually depends on C. If C had not occurred, E would not have occurred. More precisely, causation is the transitive closure of counterfactual dependence, so that C causes E if there is a chain of events linking them where each depends counterfactually on its predecessor. The appeal of this analysis is that it reduces causation entirely to counterfactuals, which are themselves analyzed in terms of possible world similarity. No primitive causal relations, no appeal to powers or necessary connections. The entire analysis bottoms out in the Mosaic. The analysis worked well for simple cases and was immediately confronted with cases that are not simple. The problem of preemption has been, in Ned Hall's words, the single biggest bugbear for counterfactual theories of causation. Here is the case in its most basic form. Two assassins, A and B, are tasked with killing a dictator. A fires first, and the bullet hits. B was ready to fire if A had missed, but A did not miss. The dictator dies from A's bullet. Now ask, is A's shot a cause of the death? The answer is obviously yes. But counterfactual dependence fails. If A had not fired, B would have fired, and the dictator would still have died. So the death does not counterfactually depend on A's shot, and the simple analysis gives the wrong answer. Lewis's initial fix was to invoke the chain requirement. Even though the death does not depend on A's shot directly, there is a chain, A's shot caused the bullet to travel to a certain point. The bullets being at that point caused the impact. The impact caused the death. Each link in the chain involves genuine counterfactual dependence, and the chain connects A's shot to the death. This works for early preemption, where the backup cause is cut off before the effect. But it fails for late preemption, where both causal processes run to completion, but one arrives first. Susie and Billy both throw rocks at a bottle. Susie's rock arrives first and shatters it. Billy's rock passes through the space where the bottle was. Here, there is no point in the causal chain where Susie's process counterfactually depends on her throw in a way that Billy's process does not, because Billy's rock is on its way in every relevant nearby world. Jonathan Schaffer identified an even more devastating case: trumping preemption. A sergeant and a major both give the order to advance. Military protocol dictates that soldiers obey the highest-ranking officer. The soldiers advance because the major ordered it, not because the sergeant did. But if the major had not given the order, the soldiers would still have advanced, because the sergeant gave the same order. No amount of tracing along causal chains resolves this, because the physical process by which the soldiers receive and carry out the order is identical in both cases. Lewis's response to these accumulating difficulties was his 20,000-word Whitehead Lectures at Harvard in 1999, published in 2004 as his influence theory. The revision was radical. Instead of asking whether C's occurrence or non-occurrence makes a difference to whether E occurs, Lewis now asked whether alterations to C produce corresponding alterations to E. C causes E when, whether, when, and how C occurs influences whether, when, and how E occurs. This is causation as influence rather than causation as dependence. The influence account handles Susie and Billy neatly. If you alter the time or manner of Susie's throw, the time and manner of the shattering change correspondingly. Alter Billy's throw and the shattering stays the same because Billy's rock never reaches the bottle. So Susie's throw is a cause and Billy's is not. But the influence account creates new problems. Ned Hall has argued that it classifies too many things as causes. Every background condition that could, if altered, slightly alter the effect now counts as a cause of that effect. The gravitational field of a distant star marginally affects the trajectory of Susie's rock. Alter the star's position, and the shattering changes by an undetectable amount. On the influence account, the star's position is a cause of the shattering. Lewis acknowledged this proliferation, but argued it was a feature, not a bug. Common sense already implicitly recognizes many more causes than we typically mention. Hall himself has argued, and this is the deepest challenge to the entire Lewisian program, that there are two concepts of causation, not one. One concept, dependence, is captured by counterfactual analysis. The other concept, production, involves actual physical processes connecting cause to effect. The cases that trouble Lewis, preemption and double prevention, are cases where these two concepts come apart. On Hall's view, no single analysis can capture both, because they are genuinely different relations that ordinary language conflates under the single word cause. If Hall is right, then the Lewisian project of reducing causation to counterfactuals is not merely technically difficult, it is addressing a question that has no single answer. And if causation requires an irreducible production component, then the Mosaic may not have the resources to ground causal claims, because production looks like exactly the kind of necessary connection between events that Humean supervenience denies. This tension between Humean causation and productive causation extends directly into the theory of laws, where the question becomes, what makes a regularity a law rather than a mere accidental pattern? Part 7. Laws and the Best System. A philosophical account of laws of nature must answer a simple question. What distinguishes a genuine law from a true generalization that merely happens to hold? All electrons have negative charge is a law. All the coins in my pocket are copper is an accidental truth. Both are true universal generalizations. What makes one of them a law and the other a coincidence? The leading anti-human answer, developed by Dretske, Tooley and Armstrong, is that laws are constituted by a relation of necessitation between universals. There exists a second-order relation N holding between the universal electron and the universal negative charge, and this relation N is what makes it a law that electrons have negative charge. The law is a fundamental feature of reality, metaphysically prior to the pattern it produces. Lewis rejected this view, and his objection is precise. If N is a contingent relation between universals, then we need to explain how the fact that N holds between Fness and Gness entails that all actual Fs are Gs. What is the connection between a relation among abstract universals and the behavior of concrete particulars? Armstrong says the entailment is primitive. It is just a brute fact that N of F and G necessitates the corresponding regularity. Lewis found this answer unacceptable because it introduces exactly the kind of mysterious necessary connection that the account of laws was supposed to explain. You have not explained how laws govern behavior. You have simply labelled the mystery. Lewis's alternative, the best system account, or Mill-Ramsey-Lewis account, works as follows. Consider all the true sentences that can be formulated in a language whose predicates refer only to perfectly natural properties. Among these, some sets of sentences systematize the facts well. They are strong, meaning they entail many truths about the world, and they are simple, meaning they can be stated concisely. Strength and simplicity trade off against each other. The conjunction of all truths is maximally strong, but not at all simple, while a tautology is maximally simple, but not at all strong. The laws are the regularities entailed by the system that best balances strength and simplicity. This account is elegant because it makes laws fully supervenient on the Mosaic. The same distribution of local qualities will always produce the same best system, and therefore the same laws. Laws are not imposed on the pattern from above. They are read off the pattern by an optimization procedure. But the account faces what Lewis himself called the problem of fit, and what critics have turned into a more general objection. The balance between simplicity and strength is not formally defined. How do you compare the simplicity gained by dropping a sentence against the strength lost? Lewis acknowledged that the balance is somewhat vague, and he accepted that there might be cases where no unique best system exists. In those cases, a regularity is a law only if it appears in every system that ties for best. Armstrong and others have pressed a deeper objection, often called the charge of ratbag idealism. If laws are just the theorems of our best systematization, then laws are partly about us, about what we find simple and informative. Different cognitive beings with different standards of simplicity would produce different best systems and therefore discover different laws. This seems to make laws mind-dependent in a way that is incompatible with their role in science. Lewis's response relies directly on natural properties. The competing systems are formulated in a language whose predicates refer only to perfectly natural properties, and these properties are features of reality, not of our minds. So the input to the competition is objective. The standards of simplicity and strength are also supposed to be objective, though Lewis never gave a full account of what objectivity means here. The pragmatic turn in recent human philosophy of laws, driven by Hall, Hicks, Dorst and Jagg and Lew, has taken the ratbag idealism charge seriously and turned it into a resource. These philosophers argue that Lewis was right to build practical relevance into the best system, but wrong to be embarrassed about it. Dorst has proposed replacing the canonical balance of simplicity and strength with criteria explicitly designed to identify systems that are predictively useful for creatures in our epistemic situation. On his best predictive system account, the laws are the generalizations that most effectively amplify limited observational information into reliable predictions about unobserved regions of the Mosaic. This pragmatic revision improves the account's ability to match scientific practice, where laws are valued precisely for their predictive power. But it costs something Lewis cared about: the claim that laws are fully objective features of reality. If the best system is best relative to creatures with particular cognitive limitations and practical needs, then laws are not mind-independent in the way that the Mosaic itself is. Nancy Cartwright has sharpened this point by arguing that our most useful scientific laws are literally false. The law of electromagnetism ignores gravitational effects, and gravitational effects are present everywhere. If usefulness, not strict truth, is the criterion, then the best system may consist of idealizations that accurately describe nothing. There is a further challenge that has emerged from cosmology. Olson and Meacham have shown that in eternal worlds, both classical eternal worlds and the kinds posited by contemporary cosmological models, the best system account produces no laws that meaningfully constrain initial conditions. In a universe that extends infinitely in time, every finite pattern occurs somewhere, and the best system's finite axioms cannot distinguish law-governed regions from chance fluctuations. If our universe is eternal in the way many physicists believe, then Lewis's account of laws is in direct tension with our best physical theories. The connection between laws and chance is the final piece that Lewis needed to complete the Humean reduction of the nomic, and it proved to be the most technically treacherous. How can the Mosaic, which is a pattern of actual occurrences, ground facts about how probable those occurrences were? This is the problem that led Lewis to what he called the big bad bug, and his solution to it restructured the relationship between chance and credence for the entire Humean program. Part 8. Chance and the Principal. A coin is tossed, lands heads. Before the toss, the chance of heads was 1/2. After the toss, the chance of heads is 1. This shift from 1/2 to 1 is not a shift in our ignorance. Lewis claimed it is a shift in an objective feature of the world. The chance function changes as time passes and new facts obtain. Objective chance for Lewis is whatever plays a specific role in connecting the world to rational belief. That role is codified in the principle, which Lewis took to be close to an implicit definition of the concept of chance itself. The principle says, a rational agent's credence in a proposition A, conditional on the chance of A being some value x and on any admissible evidence should equal x. Your beliefs should defer to the objective chances, provided you have no inadmissible information, meaning information that bears directly on whether A obtains independently of the chances. The principle looks almost trivially correct. If you know the fair coin has a 1/2 chance of landing heads, you should assign credence 1/2 to heads. The difficulty is not in the principle itself, but in making it compatible with Humean supervenience. Here is the problem Lewis called the big bad bug. On a Humean account, the chances at a time are determined by the total pattern of events across all of space-time, because chances are features of the best system that summarizes the Mosaic. This means that the chances right now depend on what happens in the future, not just on what has happened in the past. Consider a world where a coin is tossed repeatedly for all eternity. On a human account, the chance of heads on the next toss is determined partly by the entire future sequence of tosses. But some future sequences are undermining. They produce frequencies that, once fed into the best system, yield chances different from the ones the system initially assigned. The bug bites like this. Let T be the complete theory of chance for this world. T assigns a chance to every possible future history. Some of those futures are ones where the long-run frequencies deviate enough from the chances that T would no longer be the best system. Call such a future an undermining future. T assigns a non-zero chance to undermining futures because T is a probability function and extreme sequences, though unlikely, are possible. But by the principle, your credence in an undermining future, conditional on T, should equal the chance T assigns to that future, which is non-zero. Yet an undermining future is one where T is false. So the principle asks you to have non-zero credence in the falsity of a proposition you are conditioning on. That is incoherent. Lewis found this problem devastating enough to call it a reductio of human chance, if not resolved. The resolution came from Michael Thau and Ned Hall, and Lewis adopted it in his 1994 paper. Their proposal: replace the original principle with what Lewis called the new principle. Instead of setting your credence in A conditional on T equal to the chance of A according to T, set it equal to the chance of A conditional on T according to T. Since T assigns zero chance to any future conditional on T being true that undermines T, the contradiction dissolves. The new principle works technically, but critics, including Rachel Briggs, have argued that the fix is cosmetic rather than structural. The root of the problem is in the Humean ontology, not in the formulation of the chance-credence link. If chances are determined by the total pattern of events, then chances inherently carry information about the future, and the special role of chance as a guide to credence is compromised. Briggs showed that the bug cannot be escaped by retreating from realism about chance, because even anti-realist accounts of chance face analogous contradictions if they accept the Humean ontology. Bogal and Hicks have offered a different path. Their proposal is that Humean chances simply do not carry information about their own metaphysical status. The chance function does not know it is Humean in their phrase. It assigns probabilities to physical outcomes, not to metaphysical propositions about whether Humeanism is true. This dissolves the bug by restricting the domain of the chance function, but it requires denying that chance is defined over all propositions. Levinstein and Spencer's 2025 paper has argued that the problem is worse than Lewis thought. They identify what they call bigger, badder bugs, conflicts between chance and credence that arise even for the new principle under plausible human assumptions. Their argument suggests that the tension between human metaphysics and the chance-credence link is not a single solvable problem, but a recurring structural feature of the view. Janan Ismail has proposed an alternative dissolution entirely. On her account, deference to chance is not a conditional credence assignment, but an unconditional one. Set your credence to the chance when you know what the chance is. The theory of chance should not be included in the evidence base for conditionalization because it is the tool you are using to process evidence, not a piece of evidence itself. This removes the bug by refusing to conditionalize on the chance theory at all. The debate over Humean chance matters far beyond Lewis scholarship because it connects directly to how scientists actually use probability. A radiation oncologist calculating the chance that a tumor will respond to treatment is using a probability derived from long-run frequencies and physical models. The Humean says this probability supervenes on the total distribution of treatment outcomes across space-time. The anti-Humean says the probability reflects a real propensity of the tumor to respond. The difference matters when you ask why the oncologist should trust the number, and that question is the principal wearing a lab coat. Lewis's account of chance was the final piece of his reduction of the nomic. Laws, counterfactuals, causation, and chance all bottom out in the Mosaic. But Lewis's earliest published book was not about any of these. It was about convention, and it remains one of the most influential works in the philosophy of language. Part 9. Convention. Before Lewis wrote about possible worlds or causation, he wrote about a problem that every theory of language faces and that most theories of language quietly ignore. How can linguistic meaning exist at all without presupposing prior conventions, which themselves presuppose language? The circularity is genuine. A convention seems to be a regularity that people follow because they believe others follow it. But how do they come to believe that others follow it? Not by having it explained to them in language, because language is the thing being explained. The standard philosophical response was to say that conventions are somehow grounded in explicit agreements, but explicit agreements are themselves linguistic acts. Lewis solved this with a rigorous definition that requires no prior language. A regularity R in the behavior of a population P is a convention when the following conditions hold. Everyone conforms to R. Everyone believes that everyone else conforms to R. This belief gives everyone a reason to conform, because R is a coordination equilibrium. No one can do better by deviating unilaterally, given that others conform. There is at least one alternative regularity that could have served the same purpose, and all of this is common knowledge among the members of P. The concept of common knowledge, which Lewis introduced here, is itself a significant contribution. A fact is common knowledge among a group when everyone knows it. Everyone knows that everyone knows it. Everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows it, and so on to every finite level. Lewis showed that common knowledge can arise without explicit communication through what he called bases for common knowledge, public events that everyone can observe others observing, and so on. The crucial philosophical move is the appeal to coordination equilibria from game theory. A coordination problem is a situation where multiple agents benefit from matching their behavior, and there are multiple ways to match. Driving on the right side of the road is a convention in Lewis's sense. Everyone conforms because they believe others conform. The belief gives them a reason to conform, and driving on the left would work just as well as a coordination equilibrium. No one decreed that traffic should move on the right. The regularity sustains itself through mutual expectations. Language, on Lewis's account, is a system of conventions in exactly this technical sense. A language L is used by a population P when there is a convention of truthfulness and trust in L. Speakers try to utter only sentences true in L, and hearers form beliefs by treating utterances as true in L. This convention is self-sustaining because each person's conformity gives others a reason to conform, and any number of alternative languages could serve the same coordinating function. Brian Skyams has taken Lewis's signalling game framework and shown that conventions can emerge without common knowledge, without full rationality, and without anything that deserves the name of belief. Using simple reinforcement learning dynamics, agents in Skyams' models converge on signalling systems that efficiently transfer information, starting from random initial behavior. This result is both a vindication and a challenge for Lewis. It vindicates the claim that conventions need not be established by prior explicit agreement. It challenges Lewis's specific analysis by showing that the epistemic conditions Lewis required, common knowledge, mutual beliefs about others' conformity, may be unnecessary for the emergence and stability of conventional regularities. The challenge runs deeper than it first appears. Lewis defined convention through a constellation of beliefs, preferences, and knowledge conditions that presuppose substantial cognitive sophistication. Skyams' agents have none of this. They update their behavior based on past payoffs, period. Yet they reliably converge on the same signalling equilibria that Lewis identified as the targets of conventional behavior. This suggests that Lewis may have described the high-level rational reconstruction of a phenomenon whose actual causal basis is far simpler. Recent work by Barrett, Cochrane and Skyams has extended these models to show how compositional signalling, signals whose meaning depends on the combination and order of their parts, can emerge from the same low rationality dynamics. This matters because compositionality is the feature most often cited as distinguishing human language from animal communication. If compositional structure can arise from reinforcement learning in Lewis signaling games, then Lewis's original framework contains more explanatory resources than even Lewis recognized. There is an irony in this trajectory. Lewis's convention is his most empirically grounded work, dealing with actual human practices like traffic and language. Yet the framework it introduced has been most powerfully extended by stripping away the very features Lewis emphasized, common knowledge and rational belief, and replacing them with evolutionary and learning dynamics. The structure Lewis identified was real. The mechanism he proposed to sustain it was likely too demanding. Lewis's work on convention connects to his philosophy of mind through the theory of mental content. If linguistic meaning is conventional and conventions are regularities sustained by belief, then the theory of belief itself must be in place before the theory of language gets off the ground. Part 10. Philosophy of Mind. The identity theory of mind, in its classic form, says that mental states are identical to brain states. Pain just is a certain pattern of neural firing. Functionalism says that mental states are defined by their causal roles. Pain is whatever state is caused by tissue damage and causes avoidance behavior, grimacing, and the desire for it to stop. These two views look incompatible. Consider a Martian whose body is made of silicone rather than carbon, with fluid-filled foot cavities where we have neurons. When the cavities inflate, the Martian exhibits every behavioral sign of pain. It flinches, avoids the stimulus, reports distress. The identity theorist must say the Martian is not in pain because it lacks the right brain state. The functionalist says it is in pain because the right causal role is filled. Now consider a madman, a human whose pain state has become disconnected from its normal causal role. Tissue damage causes the usual neural firing, but the firing produces no avoidance behavior, no grimacing, no distress. Instead, it produces a mild urge to cross his legs. The functionalist must say the madman is not in pain because nothing in him occupies the pain role. The identity theorist says he is in pain because the right neural state is firing. Lewis's resolution. Mental states are defined functionally for a population. Pain in humans is whatever state typically occupies the pain role in humans. Pain in Martians is whatever state typically occupies the pain role in Martians. The madman is in pain because the state he is in occupies the pain role in his population, humans, even though it fails to play that role in him individually. The Martian is in pain because inflated foot cavities occupy the pain role in the Martian population. This is analytic functionalism, the claim that the meanings of mental terms are given by the causal roles described in folk psychology, and that the occupants of those roles are the reference of the terms. Lewis derives the functional definitions by treating folk psychology as an implicit theory, collecting its platitudes into a long Ramsey sentence, and then using the Ramsey sentence to define each mental term simultaneously. The result is an identity theory, because the referent of pain is a specific physical state in each population. But it is a functionalism, because which physical state it is depends on which state occupies the right causal role. The account of mental content follows a parallel strategy. What a belief is about is determined by what makes the best overall interpretation of the agent's behavior. Lewis builds on Davidson's principle of charity, but constrains it with natural properties. The content that best rationalizes the agent's behavior, given the constraint that more natural contents are preferred over less natural ones, is the content the agent actually has. This is interpretationism constrained by naturalness. Meaning is not fully in the head and not fully in the interpretation, but in the best fit between them. Lewis's response to the knowledge argument for qualia, the argument that a colour scientist who has never seen red learns something new upon seeing red for the first time, is the ability hypothesis. What Mary gains when she leaves the black and white room is not a new piece of propositional knowledge, but a new ability. The ability to recognize red, imagine red, and remember the experience of red. She knew all the physical facts before. What she gains is a new way of representing those same facts, not a new fact about the world. Wolfgang Schwartz has argued that Lewis's analytic functionalism faces a semantic problem it has not resolved. If pain denotes different physical states in different populations, then it behaves like an indexical, changing its referent with context. But ordinary speakers do not treat pain as context-sensitive in this way. We say the Martian is in pain and mean the same property we attribute to humans, not a different property that happens to share a name. Schwartz suggests that the more natural semantic treatment is to take pain as rigidly denoting a higher-level property, the property of being in whatever state plays the pain role, rather than denoting the occupant of that role in each context. This objection connects to a broader tension in Lewis's system. His philosophy of mind requires that mental terms denote realizers, the specific physical states that play functional roles, not the roles themselves. But his philosophy of language and mental content suggests that meaning tracks roles, not realizers. Whether the Lewisian system can consistently maintain both commitments remains a live and unresolved question. Lewis's view of mind is intimately connected to his view of personal identity over time, because both depend on the same underlying metaphysics of persistence and temporal parts. Part 11. Persistence and personal identity. You sit in a chair reading. A minute passes. Are you the same person who was reading a minute ago, or a different person who happens to remember being the earlier one? Common sense says you are the same person, and the answer is obvious. Lewis agreed that you are the same person, but he thought the answer is far from obvious, and that getting it right requires a specific metaphysics of how objects persist through time. There are two views about persistence. Endurantism says that an object is wholly present at each moment of its existence. The chair under you is entirely here now, and it was entirely present 5 minutes ago. The very same thing exists at both times. Perdurantism, which Lewis defended, says that objects are extended in time the way they are extended in space. You have temporal parts, a part that exists now, a part that existed this morning, a part that will exist tomorrow. The whole person is the four-dimensional worm that stretches through space-time from birth to death. Lewis's main argument for perdurantism comes from the problem of temporary intrinsics. Consider a ball that is round at one time and flat at another, after being sat on. The ball has the property of being round and the property of being flat. If the ball is wholly present at both times, as the endurantist says, then the very same thing is both round and flat. That is a contradiction. Unless you relativize the properties, the ball is round at 1 and flat at 2. But then shape is not an intrinsic property of the ball. It is a relation between the ball and a time. Lewis found this deeply implausible. Shape is a paradigmatic intrinsic property. The perdurantist avoids the problem. Different temporal parts have different shapes, and no contradiction arises, just as different spatial parts can have different colours. For personal identity, Lewis applies the same framework. You are a four-dimensional worm whose temporal parts are connected by relations of causal continuity, memory, personality persistence, and physical continuity. What makes you the same person over time is not that some soul or bare particular persists, but that your temporal parts bear these continuity relations to one another. The puzzle cases in personal identity, fission, fusion, teletransportation push this framework in revealing directions. Suppose your brain is split and each half placed in a different body, both of which wake up with your memories and personality. Are there one person or two? Lewis's answer. Before the fission, there were already two overlapping person worms sharing a common initial segment. After the fission, they diverge. This is the many persons view, and it is counterintuitive in a specific way. It implies that right now, if fission is physically possible, multiple persons share your current temporal part. Lewis accepted this consequence. The counterintuitiveness, he argued, is less severe than the alternatives, which include denying that either successor is you, or denying that fission is possible, or accepting gaps in personal identity. On the four-dimensionalist view, the multiplicity was always there. The fission merely reveals it. The deepest objection to Lewis's view of personal identity comes from what we might call the no-ownership problem. If personal identity is constituted by continuity relations between temporal parts and those relations admit of degree, then there is no sharp fact about whether a given future temporal part belongs to you or to someone else. Lewis acknowledged this and embraced the vagueness of personal identity. But critics argue that the first-person perspective resists this treatment. From the inside, it seems like a determinate fact that I will be the one experiencing what my future self experiences, not merely a vague matter of degree. This connects to Lewis's mereological views, because the notion of temporal parts presupposes that objects have parts in a metaphysically robust sense. Part 12. Parts and composition. When do some objects compose a further object? When you have a top and four legs, do you automatically have a table? When you have two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom in the right configuration, do you automatically have a water molecule? What about arbitrary collections? Your left shoe, the Eiffel Tower, and the square root of 2. There are 3 standard answers. Nihilism says composition never occurs. There are no composite objects, only simples arranged in various ways. Restrictivism says composition occurs sometimes under specific conditions, perhaps when objects are causally integrated or when they constitute a living organism. Universalism says composition always occurs. Any collection of objects whatsoever has a mereological sum. Lewis endorsed universalism, also called unrestricted composition. Any objects at all, no matter how scattered or dissimilar, have a fusion. The fusion of your left shoe and the Eiffel Tower exists. It is not an interesting or natural object, but it exists. His primary argument is that any restriction on composition faces a dilemma. Either the restriction is vague, producing cases where it is indeterminate whether some objects compose something, or it is sharp, producing an arbitrary metaphysical boundary. Lewis took both options to be unacceptable. Vague composition would mean that existence itself is vague, that it is indeterminate whether some object exists, and Lewis held that vague existence is impossible. Sharp composition would require a principled cut-off that nobody has been able to provide. Unrestricted composition avoids both horns. Every collection has a sum, so there is no question about where to draw the line. The objects that matter to common sense and science, tables, molecules, organisms, are distinguished not by having a privileged mereological status, but by being natural, in Lewis's technical sense, more natural than the arbitrary fusions that also exist. Peter van Inwagen has defended the restrictivist position that composition occurs only when the activity of some objects constitutes a life. Tables do not exist on his view, only particles arranged table-wise. Lewis found this more counterintuitive than unrestricted composition, because it denies the existence of the very objects we interact with every day, while unrestricted composition merely adds objects nobody normally thinks about. Lewis's universalism connects to his larger system through the principle that natural properties and relations, not composition, do the real work of distinguishing what matters. An ontology with many objects is not bloated if most of those objects are perfectly uninteresting. The naturalness hierarchy tells you which objects are worth talking about, just as it tells you which properties are worth predicating. Lewis developed these mereological views most fully in parts of classes, where he attempted to reduce set theory to mereology, treating sets as mereological fusions of their singletons. The project required a primitive singleton function mapping each individual to its singleton set, and Lewis was never fully satisfied with the result. He considered the need for this primitive and intellectual cost he could not eliminate, and the book remains his most technically ambitious and least philosophically resolved work. From metaphysics, we turn to practical reason, where Lewis applied the same general strategy. Reduce the normatively loaded concept, in this case rational action, to descriptive materials drawn from the Mosaic and the agent's mental states. Part 13. Causal Decision Theory. The standard framework for rational decision, expected utility theory, tells you to choose the action with the highest expected utility. The expected utility of an action is calculated by weighting the utility of each possible outcome by the probability of that outcome given the action. This is clean, powerful, and faces a devastating problem that Lewis spent significant effort addressing. The problem is Newcomb's. A reliable predictor has placed money in two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque and contains either $1 million or nothing. The predictor has already made the prediction and placed the money before you choose. If the predictor predicted you would take only box B, it placed the million in B. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left B empty. The predictor is almost perfectly reliable. Two lines of reasoning pull in opposite directions. The dominance argument says, no matter what the predictor did, you get $1,000 more by taking both boxes. The expected utility argument, calculated with conditional probabilities, says, given that you take only B, the probability of the million being there is very high, so one boxing has higher expected utility. Evidential decision theory sides with one boxing. Choose the action that is the best news, the action such that learning you had performed it would maximize your expected utility. Lewis, following Gibbard and Harper, argued this is a mistake. The evidence your action provides about the predictor's past behavior is not caused by your action. The predictor's decision is already made. Your action cannot change what is in the box. Rational decision should track causal influence, not evidential correlation. Lewis's version of causal decision theory calculates expected utility by weighting outcomes not by conditional probabilities, but by probabilities that reflect what your action would cause to happen. Formally, this involves partitioning the space of possibilities into what Lewis called dependency hypotheses, maximally specific propositions about how outcomes depend causally on actions. You weight each outcome by your credence in the relevant dependency hypothesis, not by the conditional probability of the outcome given the action. In Newcomb's problem, the dependency hypotheses specify what the predictor already put in the box. Your action does not causally influence which hypothesis is true. So the expected utility calculation holds fix the contents of the box and adds $1,000 for taking both. 2 boxing wins. Lewis was candid about the embarrassment this creates. 1 boxers systematically get richer than 2 boxers. Lewis searched for a case where the tables were turned, where evidential decision theory recommended an action that left its adherents poorer, and he could not find one. He considered this a genuine cost of his position. Recent work has made this cost harder to bear. Esterheld and Konitzer have constructed scenarios where causal decision theorists can be subjected to diachronic Dutch books, losing money with certainty through a sequence of decisions that each individually satisfy causal dominance. Their adversarial offer scenario presents a case where a straightforward application of causal decision theory leads the agent to pay money for a box whose expected causal contents do not justify the price. Levenstein and Suarez have developed functional decision theory as an alternative that permits 1 boxing in Newcomb's problem while avoiding the pathologies of pure evidential decision theory. Ahmed's 2014 book argues that the entire framework of causal decision theory rests on a confused separation of evidence and causation. If your evidence strongly supports the claim that 1 boxing will result in getting the million, then acting on that evidence just is acting rationally, regardless of whether the mechanism is causal influence or mere correlation. The causal decision theorist's refusal to act on evidence she acknowledges to be strong looks like a commitment to a metaphysical principle. Respect the causal structure that overrides practical rationality. Huteger's 2023 paper offers a partial reconciliation. Using deliberational dynamics in the style of Skyams, he shows that for certain versions of Newcomb's problem, the process of rational deliberation leads evidential and causal decision theorists to the same final decision. The reconciliation does not hold universally. When the predictor has more information about the agent's decision process than the agent has about herself, the theories diverge genuinely. But the range of genuine disagreement is narrower than the philosophical tradition suggests. Lewis's decision theory feeds directly into his account of value, where the question is what makes an action good from the agent's perspective, and whether desire can be analyzed without smuggling in normative primitives. Part 14. Value and the Dispositional Theory. Lewis held a theory of value that is simpler and more reductive than most philosophers find acceptable. Something is a value for a person if and only if the person is disposed to desire it under conditions of full imaginative acquaintance with it. Values are not objective features of reality independent of all minds. They are not arbitrary preferences either. They are what you would want if you fully understood what you were wanting. The key phrase is full imaginative acquaintance. It is not enough to know the facts about an outcome in some abstract propositional sense. You must vividly imagine what it would be like to experience the outcome, to live inside it, to encounter its every relevant detail. A person who has never experienced severe pain might abstractly desire a life of adventure involving significant risk of injury. Under full imaginative acquaintance with the pain, the desire might change. On Lewis's account, the value is determined by the desire that survives full imaginative engagement, not by the uninformed desire. This theory inherits the structure of Lewis's philosophy of mind. Desires are mental states defined by their functional role in the agent's psychology. Value reduces to desire under idealized conditions. Neither desire nor value is a primitive or irreducible feature of the world. Everything bottoms out in the mosaic and the patterns it supports. Lewis also famously investigated and ultimately rejected the thesis that desire is a kind of belief, the desire as belief thesis. On one reading, this thesis says that desiring an outcome is equivalent to believing that the outcome is good. Lewis proved a formal result, showing that if we model desire as belief about goodness within standard probability theory, and if we accept some weak assumptions about how rational agents update their beliefs, then the desire as belief thesis implies an absurdly constrained set of credence functions. The proof is technically clean, and its upshot is that desire cannot be reduced to belief about value without collapsing rational agency into triviality. The philosophical consequence is that there is an irreducible distinction between the direction of belief, which aims at truth, and the direction of desire, which aims at satisfaction. Lewis took this to be a significant result about the architecture of rational agency, not just a formal curiosity. One criticism of the dispositional theory of value is that it cannot handle values that require self-transcendence. Some people value outcomes they could not fully imagine experiencing. the continuation of a cultural tradition after their death, the flourishing of distant future generations. Full imaginative acquaintance with these outcomes seems impossible because the person cannot imagine the relevant experiences from the inside. If the dispositional theory requires imaginative acquaintance, it cannot ground these values. If it weakens the acquaintance condition to accommodate them, it loses its distinctive claim that values are grounded in properly informed experience. Lewis's ethics, like his metaphysics, is deflationary in spirit. He does not argue that nothing matters. He argues that what matters is fully explicable in terms of what creatures like us would want under the right conditions, with no remainder that requires a special faculty of moral perception or a realm of mind-independent normative facts. We end where every serious examination of Lewis must end, with the internal tensions of the system taken as a whole. Part 15. The Fracture Lines. Lewis built the most integrated philosophical system of the 20th century's second half. Its strength comes from the interdependence of its parts. Modal realism supports the semantics of counterfactuals, which supports the analysis of causation, which supports the analysis of laws, which supports the best system account, which requires natural properties, which constrain mental content, which grounds the theory of convention, which explains linguistic meaning. Everything connects. But interdependence is also vulnerability. A failure at any node propagates through the system, and the question is whether the failures we have identified are local and repairable, or structural and compounding. There are 5 major fracture lines. The first is the status of natural properties. The entire system depends on the distinction between natural and gerrymandered properties. Lewis increasingly treated this distinction as primitive, which means the foundation of the reductive program is itself unreduced. If naturalness is primitive, then Lewis's system is not a pure reduction of the modal, the gnomic, and the mental to the Humean Mosaic. It is a reduction of these to the Mosaic plus a primitive notion of structure. Every account downstream, laws, content, similarity, duplication, inherits this unexplained primitive. The second fracture is quantum mechanics. Humean supervenience requires that fundamental relations be spatio-temporal and that fundamental properties be local. Entanglement violates both requirements in ways that are not artifacts of interpretation, but consequences of experimental results, confirmed to extraordinary precision. Lewis knew this and chose to defend tenability rather than truth. But Jarg and Lowe's retreat to higher-level humanism raises its own problems. If the Mosaic at the fundamental level is non-Humean, then the claim that higher-level phenomena are aptly modelled as Humean requires an account of level-relative fundamentality that Lewis never provided. The third fracture is causation. Hall's argument that there are 2 genuinely distinct concepts of causation, dependence and production, has not been refuted. If production is an irreducible relation involving actual physical processes connecting cause to effect, then it is exactly the kind of necessary connection between distinct existences that Hume denied and that Lewis's system is built to eliminate. The counterfactual analysis of causation may capture one concept of causation perfectly well while missing another that is equally important to science and common sense. The fourth fracture is the chance-credence link. The big bad bug was patched, but Levinstein and Spencer's bigger badder bugs suggest the patch is temporary. The fundamental difficulty is structural. Human chances carry information about the total history of the world, but the role of chance in guiding credence requires that chances be epistemically independent of the outcomes they govern. These two requirements are in tension for any Humean account, and no resolution proposed so far has removed the tension rather than relocated it. The fifth fracture is the one Lewis himself may have felt most acutely. The incredulous stare at modal realism has not weakened with time. Almost no working philosopher endorses genuine modal realism. The theoretical benefits Lewis claimed for it have been partly replicated by ersatz theories he argued against, and Wilson's quantum modal realism offers a physically grounded alternative that is both more constrained and more empirically connected. If modal realism is abandoned, the reductive analysis of possibility that anchors the entire system is lost, and the Lewisian must either accept primitive modality or find a new foundation. And yet, these fracture lines have been visible for decades, and the system has not collapsed. It has evolved. Human accounts of laws are more sophisticated now than when Lewis proposed them. Counterpart theory has been refined to handle objections Lewis never addressed. The convention framework has been extended by evolutionary game theory into domains Lewis could not have anticipated. The system's resilience comes not from the truth of every component, but from its structural coherence. When one piece fails, the failure is legible. The alternatives are identifiable, and the constraints imposed by the rest of the system narrow the space of possible repairs. That is the lasting contribution, not a set of doctrines to be accepted or rejected, but a demonstration that philosophical problems are not isolated. Causation constrains laws, constrains chance, constrains counterfactuals, constrains mental content, constrains linguistic meaning. Anyone who works on one of these problems while ignoring the others is, in Lewis's framework, working on a fragment torn from a system where the fragment's shape depends on the whole. The measure of a philosophical system is not whether every piece of it survives, because no system survives intact. The measure is whether the problems it identifies are the right problems, and whether its failures point toward solutions. By that measure, Lewis's system is the most productive failure in contemporary philosophy.